Well, Christof, thank you very much for joining us for Global Thoughts. I really appreciate your time. I know you're an extremely busy man right now, so thank you so much. And Tony, Rachel, thank you for joining us. So basically, this is just a very loose structure. Christof, you can talk whatever you'd like to, but I do have a couple of questions I wanted to ask you because I did read a couple of your articles, and I'll be rereading them because I think you've got me thinking about some things. But I wanted, actually, like quite a few things. But I wanted to start with one something that came out. One, a quote from your article, "Becoming Europeans." You say, quote, "One can identify as a European without identifying with Europe, or vice versa." End quote. So, could you expound a little bit on that? What do you mean by that?
Well, the thing is that the problem is that very often, I think, in scientific terms, people just throw all things or just mess with concepts, right? Which means that people say, "Oh, I have European identity," or they ask people, "Do you feel you?" The way things are asked to people really influences also the answers that they give. And if you look at political science literature, then you see that people can, for example, think that they are a European citizen because they enjoy the rights of freedom of movement, for example, because they have certain advantages that they get from the European Union. But at the same time, they say that they do not identify as a European because that's more pointing toward cultural links and feeling of community with a much broader group of people, which also includes, for example, maybe Ukraine, for example, maybe parts of Russia, maybe Belarus. And so there is quite a lot of difference between these concepts, and very often people just lump them in together. And I think in science, as scientists, it's important to be very rigid in studying these different dimensions or forms that European identity or identification is a better term, I think, with different dimensions of Europe can take.
Okay, good. It's like I said, that sentence made me think along these lines. I think that it's good to do that. And some of my thinking paralleled what you were saying. I don't know what I'm going to ask you, and certainly we can ask Tony and Rachel. This is the concept that we always hear of global citizen, in study abroad circles, international education circle. Do you see any parallels, with that, or what would your take on the word global citizenship be?
Well, honestly, that's also something that I also investigated. I did several of my papers elsewhere, and I think we see it's a very American thing on the first thing, because in Europe, of course, exchange programs have really been promoted since the 80s with this idea of we become European citizens, and sometimes maybe this discourse on the world citizenship slips in, but it's less emphasized compared to the United States, for example, or Canada or other countries where that is really one of the main outcomes. But actually, I investigated also world citizenship, or at least people identification as a world citizen in different studies as well, along this European identity. For Europeans, of course, that is much lower compared to the identification they have with Europe or the European Union, for example. But we see the same tendency there, that it is not really increasing through international exchanges, because these people participate, they already are more inclined to feel a global citizen, for example. Like,
I agree. I think I've always felt comfortable. I mean, kind of ambiguous about that term, because how do you define a global citizenship? I remember I used to work at a university where their motto was, "We have international reach." What does that mean, really? Does that mean exchange or international
exactly.
research? I think you're right. I think that the American concept of, I guess, an exchange or study abroad is certainly different than Europe. And Tony and Rachel, feel free to jump in any time. What do you think about this? But I've always struggled with the idea of global citizenship, because I think for me, and especially now, we're probably revisiting it now with all with the virtual study abroad and these type of things. But I think for me personally, it's always learning another language. It has to be part of becoming any kind of citizen. and certainly a global citizen. And I don't know if we're doing a good job here on our end in the United States in terms of doing that. Tony, I'll put you on the spot. What do you think? Do you have any thoughts on that, or what's your conception?
Well, just it's early morning, so a cloudy head. But I would, I don't know if you know this, but I actually created a global citizenship scale to measure global citizenship, and it's based on a definition that I did years ago in part of my research. That global citizenship scale is very highly utilized, and I think for all the wrong reasons. It's utilized, I think, mostly because it's free. And it's the scale of most convenience rather than really, if that's what people want to measure. The same thing with all these other outcomes scales and inventories that we use here in the United States, such as like the IDI, good instrument, oftentimes wrongly used. If you're developing a program to create the best scientists of the world and you use an IDI, that's not going to measure, So we have so often the use of the wrong instruments. But I created that scale mostly because I was, like you, Tom, a little frustrated with seeing institutions around the country and around the world saying, we're producing global citizens, or it was in their mission statement and all of that. And so I literally sought hundreds and hundreds of articles and various different reports trying to come up with a definition. And we did ultimately. Well, actually, we didn't define it. We said that there are three dimensions of global citizenship. And they are, if I recall now, of course, my dissertation was 350 pages. You'd think I'd recall this. Social responsibility, global, I can tell you in just a moment. Sorry, cloudy head, early morning. If you go to UK faculty, if you type into a browser, you'll see we also even built into the UK faculty toolkit tools around implementing this. So anyhow, the three dimensions are social responsibility, global competence, and global civic engagement. And they're very interrelated. So you can be very globally competent and very much engaged, but you have no sense of social responsibility. Maybe back to the old Portuguese colonials, right? You can be nefarious and be engaged in the world. And so anyhow, I can go on in more depth. This is not my panel, so I don't want to get in your way, Christof. But I do think that there are definitions. Now, in the course of in the answer to your question, Tom, are we doing a good job? I would say, in fact, we're retreating from that in many ways. Especially in the past few years, and we're building more walls than bridges. But that said, I don't think that there's any decreased interest among students to want to be engaged in some form or another. I think that's actually increasing.
What I think is a problem that at least occurs in Europe, but I guess that's something that we also see in the US, because I was, of course, also thinking this over, and I also reread my papers. That's always also good to do sometimes, to remember what we said. But everything actually really, most of my research very often boils down to the same argument. And yesterday I was thinking, actually, it boils down to the idea that in educational sciences is used very often of constructive alignment, right? So study abroad program providers, they or staff in the international offices, or politicians, they say, okay, the objective of this course are we promote world citizenship, or we promote European identity. When you come back, you will feel much more European, or when you come back, you have gained valuable or you will have a better career in the job market. And this is all kind of rhetoric. Then people go abroad, they return as subjectively, of course. If you do some surveys and you ask them, like, what do you think increased through your stay abroad? Actually, all students say all the skills that are in the list, always like, yeah, that increased, that increased, that increased, that increased, that increased. But if you look at more objective assessments, then very often we see that for some things it worked, like intercultural skills, of course, language proficiency. There we see clear benefits of participation. But for some of the key objectives, actually, when you use objective measures, you see that it's not working. And I think that should normally, in principle, lead to a redefinition probably of the goals and the objective of study abroad programs, because we also, I think, have responsibility as practitioners to inform students also well about what they can really gain, and not to sell them some fairy tales about how bright their future will look like. Still, there's many benefits, but so I think what is yeah, kind of missing in Europe, and I guess in the US as well, is really some good assessments also on whether programs really get to the goals that they want to achieve. And when you see with the objective assessments that it's not getting there, that does not mean maybe that you need to change the objectives. It can also very much be that you need to change the structure or the content of the study abroad program. But I think there's much more room there for maneuver and intervention than is being done today. And also on global citizenship.
Well, Christof, if I may say, I think you're exactly right. And the reason why this is happening, at least in the United States, when we look at these types of education abroad, for example, we oftentimes, as practitioners, get confused by somehow our goal is to get more students to study abroad, not to design programs to reach these particular intentional outcomes. In other words, what I mean is somehow the getting more students abroad is the goal, rather than using education abroad as a methodology among many methodologies to reach the outcome. And so therefore, I think what happens is we send students abroad as if somehow getting on a plane magically transforms a student's identity. And it doesn't. And why would it? And so it just seems a bit silly, because you can go abroad. I can go straight there to one of those LGBT free zones in Poland and have an American experience there in the vicinity of all of that hatred and never really face it. So it doesn't, being abroad is not the goal. The goal is to leverage what we do in the programs to reach these outcomes. And sometimes we lose sight of that.
Yeah.
I completely agree, Tony and Christof, with what you both said. You know, I recently came across a program that's promoting itself as patriotic study abroad, and its objective is to take American students abroad to where American troops had victories. You know, Normandy and places like that. And for me, it was almost like a paradox, right? Patriotic study abroad, they just almost don't come together. But those type of programs just it just blew my mind away. I was just very surprised.
Go abroad and learn how
exactly,
good you are.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's I thought about writing to the professor, but I said, look, I better not. That's a battle I don't really want to get into. But it's disappointing that that type of concept is out there.
So
Let's see.
Just to go back to Tony's point of this idea of just the act of getting on a plane and going somewhere different, just the simple act of exposure is going to somehow achieve these outcomes that we want for students. Obviously, that's not how it works. And one of the unfortunate outcomes of COVID, I think, I used to work for IES Abroad. Tony, I know you did too. The big guys are going to be the providers that survive, and the little mom and pop shops, those smaller programs that were really very attentive to students, had maybe 15, 25 students on a program where students really were developing global citizenship or all of the other skills we want them to develop. Those programs aren't going to be around anymore. And so I think an unfortunate consequence of COVID is this retraction of the field and a limiting of options where pretty much only the bigger guys are going to survive. So I do worry about our ability, if the goal is just to get more students abroad, especially now to try and save these companies and pad their bottom lines when everyone's been struggling so much, are we going to lose that attention to developing these skills? That's a concern that I have.
I think that's a very valid point, Rachel. I think that's an issue that we're going to have to look at. What is the new landscape going to look like after the pandemic, whenever there is a vaccine? Yeah, I know some colleges in the States still have students abroad right now as we speak, and they plan on sending them abroad in the spring. What does that mean? Does that mean that they're not as attentive to health and safety issues as some other providers maybe? I don't know, but it's something I think that's being
So
discussed in
let
the
me
field.
ask you,
Yeah.
Christof, since we're on this topic of education abroad at the moment, the and the panel that Tom and I had earlier this week, we talked, I mentioned in a sidebar that we need to maybe to edit the definition of what is called education abroad. If you look at the Forum on Education Abroad definition, for example, they say literally refer to somebody being abroad as education abroad. It makes sense in that world. But now I'm beginning to question that. And I wrote a little blog post over the weekend about this. Haven't sent it out yet, but the point I want to make in that blog is that maybe we do need to consider other forms of international learning and engagement and somehow expand or come up with a new term. What do you think about that?
Well, I definitely agree that in that sense, maybe COVID-19 is a good thing, right? In the sense that these efforts of internationalization at home, etc., might, and virtual mobility also, for example, might really finally take off a little bit because it has been there for quite some time, but never been used very extensively. But also, I would say there again, we see exactly the same problem occurring as well. And this is something I've been working on very recently. I'm finalizing a paper on inclusive internationalization, which precisely wants to look at, okay, so then you have these inclusive internationalization programs, and they aim then to provide international experiences to students, for example, who are not able to go for many reasons, because they have children, because they have a low socioeconomic status, so they don't have financial capital, because they're of a certain background. But then I was wondering, okay, what do we see here? Do then people who design these inclusive internationalization strategies, do they also investigate, do they assess whether they reach these groups? And apparently not, or at least if you know studies that really assess, do these activities which aim to broaden up the internationalization agenda to everyone, do they really reach everyone? The results of my study only in Belgium and the Netherlands, so it might be very contextual, but they suggest actually that it is not doing this. So education abroad is just one thing wherein we know that there is a huge selectivity. And indeed, okay, we might say, well, we adapt that definition and we include also, for example, virtual mobility, etc. But also there, the question then is, okay, do we talk about the same phenomenon? Do we see the same populations, or can we maybe use these forms also to increase social inclusiveness? Can we promote the social inclusion of many students who otherwise do not have access when this become normalized? Because for them it would be a huge advantage, one could say, in the sense that if they don't have the financial means to move abroad, virtual mobility comes on a pair with education abroad, or really geographical mobility is valued also by employers in the same way, because these are all, of course, also considerations. That would be very useful. But for now, it seems that also these efforts are just preaching to the converted in a certain sense. And that is something that I think is still quite a lot of work needed, both in science in terms of advancing our understanding of how do social inequalities intersect with these different forms of internationalization of education abroad, as well as in terms of practice. How do we target it? What kind of things can we develop that do work, for example? And that means really designing projects where you talk to the students and inquire about, okay, what drives them not to participate. And I think there is the key, not to participate in certain actions or programs, or to ask them, what would you participate in if we would create new programs? And that would provide fresh insights, I would say, instead of just copying what other institutions do, and then we all do more or less the same in different institutions, without really trying to innovate. I think there is quite a lot of room there for innovation still.
I'm completely optimistic about what the future holds. As we've talked before, I see that now we have multiple, if you think of the international student learning and engagement, we have an expanded continuum. Whereas we've always focused on mobility, now we could look at hybrid and virtual, as well as, and more importantly, even internationalization at home. On Wednesday at that debate we had mentioned, I asked the debaters, why do you, no, they're both non-Americans, but I asked them, why do you think this concept of internationalization at home, which is so in your bailiwick, Christof, why has that not taken hold in the United States? I mean, yeah, you can go to most campuses and see international flags hanging in a dining hall, but that's just about as close as we get to internationalization at home. Sometimes you might find a faculty member who mentions a case study from another country, but generally we don't prioritize. And my reasoning, and they didn't answer this, but my thought is it's just because it's not tied to revenue gain. So I wonder what your thoughts are. Why do you, to the extent that you know here, Christof, why do you think that the US is still overwhelmingly aligned to mobility and not focusing on internationalization at home, which would then build up access to all students, not just to the privileged few?
Yeah, but I'm also positive about this, Tony. So in the sense that I think internationalization at home has, and virtual mobility have the potential to really broaden up. But what I see is that so far it's not achieving this, not in Europe, not in the US, where it does not. Why is it not? Probably it has to do also with financial concerns and with international, how internationalization is measured, right? In the rankings, mobility is still very important, much more valued compared to internationalization activities at home. Also among scientists, for example, if you want to move up, very often, I remember when I was doing a research day in Rome at Academia Belgica, I would meet professors who were obliged to go abroad because they would only get promotion if they would have international experience. So there's still this emphasis on mobility, because that's how it's calculated in the rankings, which then influence also the financial models in many countries, or the finances that universities get, because there is a benchmark on whether you're doing well or you're doing, and so I think that influences quite a lot the incentive that universities also get to really start this internationalization at home activities, because as you say, it's more now about the numbers really than the content of the programs.
I like what you just said, Christof, and Tony. I agree with you both. You know, I always like telling the story. I used to be resident director in Cuba, and one of the first things I did is I removed my students from the student residency. They stayed with 30 other American students, and I placed them with host families. But before that, you know, when they were living there, I heard one day, because my apartment unfortunately was right next to this residence hall, so I heard all the parties. I heard one student complain loudly, say, "I can't believe," referring to me, "that he makes his students speak Spanish all the time. I speak Spanish in my Spanish class, and that should be enough." And this is a student who was spending a semester in Havana. Another student, I asked, she said, "Look, why are you making your students speak Spanish every day?" And I said, "Well, they're here in Cuba to learn Spanish." And I said, "Why are you here?" And she said, "Well, we're here to study the culture, not the language." And so in her mind, she had that distinction. And it's just these arguments. And I think this goes exactly, the point of her origin is what you both had just said. It starts on the home campus. You know, it's not prioritized enough, I think. And you're right. I'd like to see how we can get there, but I don't know. But I want to throw this out to you, Christof, because I was not familiar with this expression until I read your article, the Transactionalist Thesis. Could you explain that a little bit? And then how would that be affected by this new post-pandemic education abroad experience? Let's say that we take the geography part out, the travel part. Can the transactionalist thesis still thrive in a new post-pandemic era and study abroad?
Yes, I certainly think that is possible. Just one comment on your Cuban experience. I also think that's interesting in the sense that that it illustrates how students are also influenced by the policy discourse, we can say, that exists in these programs, right? We might think, well, we formulate here some policy objectives, what the program will do. Students won't read it, and they just go abroad because they like to go abroad. But as they are exposed, they also incorporate that or embody this, as they would say in sociology. But I think virtual mobility would really allow for this transactionalist thesis, and that is the idea that students' identity can really change through social interaction with students from other cultures, particularly again with regard to these social inequalities, in the sense that it has such potential to inform students who otherwise would not be able to have such experiences, to connect to students in other countries. Rachel, thanks for joining. So I think virtual mobility certainly has this potential, but it also requires, of course, a lot of effort by university staff to really explore all possibilities that we have there to connect people, and that's something that probably still requires time. But I see, I'm already thinking, like, it would be very nice if sometimes I could just expand my courses at university to other universities and do that together, and then get students really engaged, for example, in breakout rooms. If you really have such interactive experiences and really connect people on a regular basis on that sense, I think that might really matter. Because when I teach, for example, now everything is online. At the end of the course, for example, in the evaluation, students really tell, well, you know, we really like is that we have these breakout rooms, because that's where you really connect with the other students, and you really get to know each other. And these are Dutch students who do that together. So if you would be able to do that on a very regular basis, and always randomly people, so that you don't have, like in class, that they stick to their own group of people that they always would stick with, then I think there's a huge potential for, and maybe also to foster global citizenship, to come back to that point.
No, I think those are good arguments. I think that's what we need. I think, like I said, I love that the expression transactionalist thesis. I think for me, it really is. It's an important part. I think the engagement is the important part, even if it has to be virtual now instead of going abroad. But I think like what Tony says, it has to be a pedagogy. It can't, you know, how are we affecting these changes? I think Mike Wolf, our colleague, always says, the problem with traveling is you always take yourself with you, and that's true. I think we have our own baggage. Thanks, Tony. Good luck.
Bye, Tony.
I'll come back to you both. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Bye.
It's the idea that, and again, Mike has also been critical of people. You know, in Americans, we say students will say, "I study abroad transformed my life." And Mike said, no, you could say, I transformed my life through study abroad. Because he says, look, you should be active and not be passive. And I think that's exactly what you're saying, Christof, is students need to be active, program providers need to be active. And that's what we're trying to do with Abroadia. Just to give you a background of my organization, I started it. We're not going to compete with CIEE and all these other big providers, but we don't want to. You know, we because one, we didn't want our programs to be all over the world, like Africa, Asia, Europe, South America, because then people would say, well, Tom, what's your theme? What's your thread? And I said, oh, well, hey, we create global citizens. I would take the easy way out. And I don't like that. I want to say, look, our focus is Cuba and Latin America. So you know exactly what we're about, right? Spanish and learning the Latin American culture and history, etc. It's much easier that way than focusing around the whole world. I couldn't do that anyway. That's too many countries to keep track of. But the thing that we do, and I've stated this, is immersion. We want students engaging other students. So look, you didn't go down to Bolivia to meet another New Yorker, another American. You went to engage those people there. So we do, in our programs, we have that. We have a strong volunteer internship program. You know, the students live with host families, and we put one student per family. In other programs where I used to be a resident director, we would put 2 students per family. But then the problem was that they'd always spend time in a room together talking with each other in English, never really
Yeah.
engaging the family or learning the language. So it's more of an effort. And I always like telling this story too. I was stuck in Havana during the Hurricane Irma a couple years ago in a hotel with other people, and we were playing dominoes all night long with some Cubans. And I met this French woman, really wonderful person. And she said, look, yeah, I studied abroad. I studied for one year in a university in California. And she said to me, to all of us, the international students, look, you're on your own. If you need something urgent, we're here to help, but you're on your own. Whereas with Americans going abroad, I've heard the expression pastoral care. They have to be handheld.
Mm-hmm.
I actually visited a college here, not far from where I live. And they said, look, Tom, we like the programs that you offer, but our students need to be handheld. They wouldn't be able to handle that. We created our own program in Spain where they take classes just with each other, and we'll bring in a Spanish professor to teach them.
Yeah.
That, for me, that's a bubble program, and I think we see a lot of that. And that's what we're trying to stay away from. But I think we have to revisit that idea of engagement and immersion, I think.
Yeah, and there is a lot of institutional responsibility there, right, as well, in the sense that what is very often reported in Europe is that receiving universities very often would also say, well, we have so many exchange students, so it's easier if we just offer these courses separately to exchange students, and then you get students who virtually have no possibility of engaging with the local population because they get their courses in English in France, for example, or in Spain or in Italy, and they build up connections with other international students, and of course they have a very nice experience. That's not to say that this experience cannot be worthwhile, and they also learn intercultural skills, but in terms of immersion into the host country's culture, that of course is much less, and in terms of establishing long-lasting links with people in the destination country, that's also much less. And I think with virtual mobility also, there are possibilities there, but it is difficult to foster such deep connections, I think, also through virtual mobility, to really make people to engage in a deep, in-depth relationship. That is something, it's probably possible. I'm also very positive and optimistic about that, but that's something that we probably still need to figure out by trial and error, probably by trying things, and then it doesn't work the way it works. Yeah,
it's going to take some time. I know that. Another thing, you had written or done some research, I think, like in terms of labor outcomes, like for people who we always say here in the United States, well, when a student studies abroad, that makes them much more attractive to a future employer. But I think you have some research that tells a little bit of a different story, correct?
Yeah.
What does it say, your research?
Well, I think here, and I'm not the only one saying it, I think Knut Petzold, for example, from Germany, Nikolai Netz, they're all saying the same, basically. The problem, I think, is that for a very long time, the field has been dominated in scientific terms by people who use subjective measures, right? So what do? Compare it with filling this glass here with coffee beans, and then you just, that's about 500 grams, right?
Right.
And then that's what you do when you ask after an exchange experience to students, like, okay, do you think it increased your employability? Of course they say yes. It increased everything, because people have a tendency always to justify also the investment they make in, for example, participating in exchanges. So it's not unlogical. Or then they would just ask people 2-3 years after they enter the labor market, they would ask former students, like, do you think your exchange helped to find you a job? Of course, they would all say, like, yes. And yesterday, for example, I read the Erasmus impact study again, also because I read the papers again. And then I see, for example, 83% of the students who participated in a program report that their European identity increased. Of course, people will always see these positive benefits, but what I argue there as well, actually what we need to do is we need objective measures, right? So we need a balance to exactly measure, okay, how much is it? How many grams of coffee beans do we have right here? And if you start to do that, if you assess several career outcomes that people can have, think about salaries, think about maybe leadership tasks that they have, the type of profession they get in, etc. There's many outcomes that you can think about. Job satisfaction would be also one of the outcomes you could investigate. Then you could investigate, okay, we separate those from who studied abroad and those who did not study abroad. What do we see then? Most of the studies indicate the same. Then you still see that those who studied abroad, they have an advantage compared to those who did not study abroad. But then what I do in the paper is what is an approach that emerged over the past 3-4 years particularly, is to take account of selectivity, because those who participate in exchanges are not a random subset of the student population. They are students who come from generally socioeconomic better status. They have more financial capital, they have more social capital, they have more cultural capital.
Right.
In some, they already have some characteristics that make it much more likely to do it better on the labor market. And if you control for such characteristics, then you see that actually education abroad is not really paying off. And that's something that has been reported by studies also in Germany, for example, Knut Petzold. You also have Giorgio Di Pietro, for example, in England, who did the same. They find the same. Interestingly, however, for Giorgio Di Pietro's study was that he discovered that for those who are very unlikely to participate but do participate, think about people from a very low socioeconomic status, that they do seem to have some benefits from participation. But then that leads to the conclusion, of course, that there is much to do in terms of getting these people into these programs. If these are the ones that benefit most, we need to be much more inclusive again, and we need to tackle these inequalities that exist in access to mobility. And that's the first step.
You know, I think you're completely right. I always like telling this story. Years ago when I studied abroad, I studied in Madrid. And it was with students from all over the US, different colleges, different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I had a really good friend, really young African-American girl. Her name was Donna. And toward the end of the semester, you know, she had worked at the office. She gave something to another student from University of Pennsylvania. And she said, look, this is for you. And then she said, you know, I know your name. Do you know mine? And the other student, she didn't, but she answered, oh, you're making me feel bad. And that stuck with me because of the dichotomy of the difference between the experiences, their expectations, the perceptions of those students. One came from a very wealthy family, obviously, with a completely different perception of what she wanted her study abroad experience to be, and we had another one from another part of the population. But it resounded with me, and I think, and it confirms we need to get more. We need to make study abroad available to many more people, not just a certain sector of the U.S. population, which sadly it is.
That, of course, is not always a popular policy message, you know,
Right.
in the sense that you have this is, of course, something that has been debated in Europe as well, and I remember that once I was at the policy seminar of the European Parliament in Andorra. It was a very nice setup. They invited I don't remember exactly how many, but like more or less an equal amount of scientists focusing on student mobility. Then you had people from education abroad providers and intermediaries, and then you had politicians. And then the main conclusion there was that socioeconomic inequalities in access need to be tackled, which the best thing to do is to provide more financial support to those who need it, basically. But then for the policymakers, that was a very difficult thing to do, because they said, well, everybody, well, the liberals, for example, would say, well, everybody's born equal, everybody has the same chances, so we cannot diversify that much and give more money to those who are poor, because it's the parents are to blame, for example. That's very
Right.
and that at that moment, I really remember that struck me like, okay, so how are we then also going to change things as scientists, right? And At that moment, I was still optimistic, but there, and I think if you work together with intermediaries, for example, or study abroad providers, which is a much more common way to organize it in the United States, for example, then you have many more possibilities of really getting to such inclusive approach.
Yeah, I like that. I agree. I think one thing that it's been on my mind lately is in the US now we're trying to get more STEM students, the science, technology, engineering, and math students to go abroad, which is fine. We certainly want more. But I think the concern I have is now most of the host universities or where those students are going to study have to adapt to them. Or in other words, they need to be able to offer more classes in English, I think, for them, certainly with a high STEM component. What are your thoughts about that? Is it? I mean, I think it can be fixed, don't you think? It's not a good system the way it is right now.
Well, I think if universities need to adapt and they have to offer some courses in English, I don't think that is something entirely wrong, because also for the students in these countries, it might be beneficial also in terms of improving their English and in getting their international experience at home, basically. But what I really think is necessary there then is that really also the local student population participates in these classes. And that's, I think, where it often goes wrong. Because if you then just send these STEM students out, they have these separate classes again, then what you want to get at is actually lost again. So here, I think it's always essential from the receiving institutions to really try to mix these populations as much as possible, and buddy programs can be informative there. Mixed accommodation can be very informative there, because that's also what you very often see. Maybe they have classes together, but then all international students are lumped together in certain buildings, sometimes even far outside of the city, so they have to travel very far to the city center, to the university.
Right.
And afterwards, as they have to return, they don't even have time to go for a beer or a coffee or a tea with the students from that specific location. So there's many different ways that this integration, it's not just putting them together, but also thinking about the environment, right? Like how do we organize accommodation, etc. So it's a multifaceted problem, I would say.
I'm going to bring in Celia. Celia is a friend and colleague I know. Maybe she can share some thoughts. She's originally from France and she studied abroad in the United States. So I think we could have another European perspective here. Celia, do you have any insight, any comments? Well, maybe in a minute. Maybe she's still connecting. I think she just sent something by text. Oh, she has connection issues.
Okay.
That's okay. That happens. So no problem, Celia. That's perfectly fine. I do like what you've been saying, Christof, because I think in the United States, you're right. We need more science. We need more empirical studies. I think a lot of American study abroad is based on anecdotes, and personal narratives, personal stories. I remember evaluating some student materials who went abroad, and they say, oh yeah, I feel I've grown. I can handle things on my own. I've become more self-reliant. I can handle ambiguity. That's how many study abroad offices promote study abroad. Say, look, hey, students can learn how to handle ambiguity. But then nothing really intercultural until maybe recently over the last few years. But these things like handling ambiguity, becoming more self-reliant, that's normal developmental growth. I think that should just happen at a college and university normally. It shouldn't happen during a study abroad experience. Study abroad experience should be becoming more proficient in another language, having international friends, your transactional thesis in play, really, creating an international network. I rarely saw that in these student comments. Like when we said, well, what do you want when you go abroad? Oh, I want to become more independent, things like that. And it's so we have a ways to go, I think.
But I think it's a universal problem, and it's something that you also see back in Europe, that And it's also the main argument that Tony, Bernard, and I make in the book that we published last summer, right? That there is potential for more conversation between practitioners and scientists, but it's not there yet, and we still need to go a long way. But it would, and that's the most important, I think, it would benefit the students if really scientists start to work together with practitioners and engage together also in producing research, because, well, also we produce our papers, we publish them, that's also something as scientists now, we publish them in some specialized journals. Practitioners do not have access to them. We write in Chinese very often, and we formulate some practical recommendations without having any knowledge about the constraints also that exist in terms of room that practitioners have to make some changes, for example. And so then they think, oh, here's this unrealistic person again writing some recommendations because a journal editor asked him or her to do so. So I think there is something that we need to do there, but also I think there is from the practitioner side, and I think in the US, for example, NAFSA, for example, could play a much greater role there as well, because that also seems to become, and the forum also seem to become much more practitioner organizations rather than really collaborating with scientists. And that is something I think, what for the next years, I think is something on my agenda at least, to try as much as possible to foster that connection much more, because it can lead us to solve some questions that you have, and at the same time we can provide you answers to things that you want an answer to. So I think that it can be very beneficial also because practitioner organizations very often have also access to data. They organize many things. They just use that descriptively, and they publish it maybe in a report, and that's it. We do not know about this, but very often these surveys or interviews can be very informative for scientific purposes as well, and to tackle really fundamental scientific questions. So I think there is quite a lot of work there to do, and I think that would be very important to really advance the field, to really foster much more that interaction.
Oh, good. I think that's a great objective. I think, I mean, there certainly is a lot of work to do. You know, I think as we come to the end here, I just want to see Christiana or Celia. Do you have any comments? If not, I'm ready to end with a good joke, which sadly isn't really a good joke. But
is that the standard way to end?
Well, I like to, in a way. Let's see. I guess I'll say it anyway. You know, it was a few years ago, I think, when the U.S. invaded Iraq. I think someone had on one of these stickers on their car. I forgot what the word is for it, and it said, "God invented war so Americans could learn geography." And I laughed, I chuckled, but I said, you know, there might be some truth in that. I hate to say this. I'm still working on my geography. I'll be one of the first people to admit it, but I do go online. I have an app on my phone. I'm trying to work on that. I'm having trouble with the stand countries, of course, but I always like to show to my students, I'm always learning. It's never too late to keep learning. But I think in the United States, and again, this goes back to both what you and Tony said, is we need to bring back geography into the U.S. curriculum. It's been dropped at the elementary level, certainly the high school level. We need to have that. It's indisputable. But I don't know when that's going to happen. Well, anyway, Christiana, Celia, if you have no questions, I think, Christof, do you have any final thoughts? You mentioned your upcoming publication. Where will that be?
Oh, no, that's something we don't know yet.
Okay.
Almost finalized, and we are going to submit it before Christmas.
Okay.
But I think that I really have very high hopes for that paper, because I really think it is providing this essential thing that I think that is very often missing in international education literature, and that is like, we do a lot of things, but do we really reach those people who we want to reach out? And or are we just building these programs for the wealthy people who already have routine access actually to these?
Right.
So just adding there, and that's not communistic. That's what Trump would say probably if you, if you say this kind of things. No, but I truly believe that if inclusive internationalization is something that we need to achieve, that there is quite some work that we still need to do, and that science can help practitioners quite a lot in guiding possible directions, and a conversation between science and practice will be hugely beneficial for both.
Good. Very well said. Well, Christof, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate that. I know you are very busy, you have a lot to do, so thank you for taking a little bit of your time to speak with us.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invitation. That's very kind.
And thank you to Tony for joining us, for Rachel, Christiana, Celia, thank you for joining us. And we'll have another Global Thought session soon. So thank you again, Christof.
You're welcome.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.